Hello, comic creators. Welcome back to the Comics Connection podcast, where we talk to you about the business and creative aspects of being a professional comic book creator, comic book publisher. My name is Gamal. He's Andy. And today we're actually talking about some of the unsung heroes in the comic book production process and the things that they have to kind of deal with in their role as a comic creator. Andy, I know that you are actually familiar with a lot of comic book colorists, and it seems like right now, even more than normal, there's a big crunch happening with colorists across the board, no matter what kind of publisher they are working for. Do you want to kind of elaborate a little bit on that and talk about what's going on with them?
Yeah, it's not uncommon that color artists get crunched. But let me just do a quick overview on sort of the coloring process. So in the in the grand scheme of things, if you've got a different person doing each of the roles, right? One person writing, one person doing penciling, one person doing inking, one person doing coloring, one person doing lettering. That is generally speaking sort of like the workflow, right? It goes from one to the next to the next, because once one person's job is done, then the next person's job can start. What happens is once the artwork is inked and it's scanned and it becomes a digital file, at that point it usually goes to, if you're talking about like a Marvel and DC that are cranking out content on deadline, those digital files go usually to the letterer and to the color artist at the same time. So those two
Mhm.
can do their work simultaneously. And then they'll do their different files, and then those will get merged at the end. They'll
Mm.
get composited at the end. But the color artist often has sort of their own workflow. I mean, everybody has their own workflow within the process. So if you drill down a little bit on the coloring, first the work needs to be flatted, which
Mhm.
means basically somebody goes in, typically in Photoshop, and cuts out all the different sections where you're going to want to modify colors, change colors, makes all of these shapes, and then puts what's called flat color, which is just straight color,
Mhm.
like your old like paint bucket, just pop. And it doesn't even have to be the right color, right?
Mhm.
In fact, some color artists actually don't want the person doing the flatting to guess what the actual color is, because then it gets harder to tell, like, did I do that section, did I not? Whereas if it's like glaringly wrong,
Mhm.
like red instead of yellow, then they know, oh, I didn't do that yet. So that's going to be up to your individual color artist preferences. Some color artists will do their own flatting of the colors. A lot of them hire that out to somebody else, so that puts yet another person in that production chain.
Mhm.
And what
Mhm.
happens often is, for one reason or another, color artists are often dumped a large number of pages at the end, and all of the lead time has been taken up elsewhere in that supply chain, quote unquote.
Mhm.
And so what happens is this pressure gets put on the color artists, letterers too, often. Hey, can you turn this around in 24 hours? And sometimes you're handed 5 pages, 10 pages, sometimes an entire book. And can you turn this around in 24 or 48 hours, that sort of thing. And that's the crunch, right, that we're talking about. And
Mhm.
what I've been seeing a lot in various places where I hang out with color artists is that this seems to be happening a lot. Like, they're usually, I'm not really kind of in the thick of that conversation, other than commiserating and just saying, yeah, that sucks. uh but but it just seems to be happening a lot, or at least to a lot of the colorists that I talk with and hang out with. But I thought it would be worth talking about sort of efficiencies in that process. And
Mhm.
so what I wanted to kind of get at is, a lot of color artists who can thrive in that environment have thrived because they've gotten so technically good at, whether it's Photoshop or Manga Studio. uh, uh, that's the wrong name for it, but there are multiple coloring softwares that you can use, but
Mhm.
they get really efficient with them. And they get a system down, and they get people that they can count on. They also get good at kind of pushing back when they really need to. But a lot of times what happens is they wind up sort of having this conversation, whether it's just a conversation in their own head, or if they are literally having this conversation with an editor or a production manager or somebody about, well, I can give it to you tomorrow,
Mhm.
or I can make it good.
Right.
Right. And so that conversation I do tend to get into sometimes with some of my friends, because there's this really tough um there's this really tough debate um about, is being a workhorse somebody that an editor can depend on to turn stuff in a timely manner, is that actually good for your career in the long run? Like, hey, I did 10 pages overnight, so that's a nice big paycheck. They're not great, but the editor knows they can depend on me. Are they going to give me more work? And
Mhm.
what can happen is that they get stuck in this position of being the guy that only does work really
Right.
fast, and they never get a chance to show what they can really do if given a proper amount of time to color pages. And it can be really hard to work out of that cycle. The worst case scenario in that cycle is that then people believe that that's the best you can do,
Right.
and you just stop getting work from that editor or that company or that sort of thing. So the conversation I tend to be in is with color artists who get kind of start to feel like they're getting trapped. Excuse me. Is, how do you get out of that? How do you make sure that if you take one of those hits for the team, which is kind of how I see it,
Mhm.
how do you get an opportunity? Like you need to actually be actively talking about that and chasing it to make sure that you get the chance to have your best foot forward as often as possible, because that's the way that you keep a career going for a long time.
Okay.
So it's just
Okay.
been a yeah, it's been kind of crazy watching it happen. Like, it just seems like all of a sudden there's this massive crunch on color artists.
Well, I want to talk about where the crunch actually comes from in the whole production process. But the first thing I really want to talk about is, how does a person decide that they're going to become a colorist? Because I know if you want to become a writer, you could get an MFA, or you could just start writing and learn as you're making comics. With you know being a artist, you can go to art classes, you could do different sorts of things to kind of build up your skill set as an artist. Is it the same with a colorist, or is there a specific educational program you have to kind of go through to learn how to be a colorist?
You can definitely learn at art schools.
Mhm.
You're definitely going to learn how to use Photoshop and the tools of the trade. Whether or not you learn specifically comics coloring is really was going to depend on if your school has a sequential art department that's
Mhm.
pretty solid. We offer at Comics Experience, we offer comic book coloring courses, and there's one that starts soon, starts on May 6th, the introduction to comic book coloring. You don't have to have any experience, and by the end of the 6 weeks, you should be up. You should have all the tools to be able to color a comic book page, like
Okay.
actually color it well. We've got that classes starting very soon, um yeah, but we start at the basics. We teach, like, and what Soto, who's a well-known regarded colorist who teaches it, Chris Sotomayor, what he does is he starts with, like, here's Photoshop, and here's the couple of tools you're going to need to learn. He doesn't teach you everything Photoshop can do, because you don't need to know all that. He just teaches you
Mhm.
what you need for coloring comics. And that's how we get people, up to speed and kind of in. And he talks a lot too about, like, how to break in, like how to show your portfolio around, and how to do, how do you get into it. It seems like right now, like, we could use some more color artists. One way to alleviate that crunch is for there to be more color artists coming in. But
Mm.
there are a lot of people that color pages that don't do it up to the level that, a lot of these, like, paying, especially the higher paying gigs, require. And that is hard to do. That's why we have advanced level courses too, is to get you to up to that level. Um but yeah, that's the best way to do it, is to learn how to do it, get the artwork, start coloring pages, build your portfolio, and then get out there. But I don't see a lot of publishers because most of them, frankly, there have been layoffs over the last year at most,
Mhm.
or I don't know if it's most, but a lot of the bigger publishers, you know, everybody's strapped for time. So there's a time crunch on the editors too, and they don't have a lot of time to go searching out new color artists. They
Mhm.
are looking for new pencilers, they're looking for new writers, but I don't know how much they're looking for new color artists. And so it takes being a little bit bold to
Mhm.
break in. And a lot of times it comes from recommendations, right? If you wind up having a good relationship with other color artists, they can sometimes recommend you for gigs, or they can, you can flat for one of them. If you become good and efficient and reliable at that, then they can kind of help you progress from there. There are a lot of
Okay.
different ways that you can break in as a color artist.
Okay. Okay. Now understanding that piece, when we get to specifically talking about the crunch is, I suppose, assuming for those who are not familiar with the concept, that there is a production schedule that's on a timeline, and everybody has a certain amount of time to complete their component of the work. Crunch occurs when the time that you were supposed to be given is now no longer available, and you have a fraction of that time. Whether you were supposed to get a week and you get like 2 days, you're supposed to get a month and you get like a week, that you like your time frame is shortened. Now, Andy, is that because the overall timelines get moved up? Is that because someone else further up the chain took longer than they were supposed to take? Is that because mistakes were made? What's usually the reason why the colorists and the letterers get hit with that kind of time crunch at the end?
It is all of those things. So it can be that a deadline gets moved up for one reason or another. That's relatively rare in my experience. Even at Marvel or when I was at IDW, I rarely did we bump things up on a schedule
Mhm,
unless that thing was ahead of schedule and was already pretty much done,
mhm,
and we wanted to fill in a gap. And sometimes the conversation would come up like that, like when I was at IDW, and I'd say, you know what, I have this miniseries. We were going to release it later, but it's pretty much done already, and there's no reason not to publish it earlier. Like it's not like
mhm.
it doesn't like ruin a storyline somewhere else or something,
Right.
you in those cases. But that's different, right? That's because we actually are ahead of schedule, in which case,
Mhm.
great. Most comic creators have never met anything ahead of schedule. Um, I think those projects are fairly rare. But sometimes a deadline can get moved up because a publisher needs it to for one reason or another, and then you can go, okay, well, if we crunch this, maybe we can get it done and it'll still be good. And sometimes, usually if you're the editor, what happens is they come in and they're not like asking you, like,
Mhm,
can you get this done? They usually tell you, like, hey, you just lost a month because this has to go this date now. And then you're like, oh, okay, great. And then you got to rebuild your schedule from scratch and start making phone calls and telling everybody that you're ruining their day. But then there are certainly times when, some part of the sequence, I mean, this is all art, right? It's all creative endeavor. So
mhm,
you can only predict how long it's going to take you to do something so accurately. There's always going to be some,
mhm,
room in there. It might happen sooner, it might happen later. Again, almost never happens sooner, almost always happens a little bit later. So yeah, sometimes it's just that, you know, days or weeks get eaten out of the schedule as it goes along, and which creates a crunch at the end, which is fairly common. It's more common than I care to care to admit. One of the things that I did as an editor um, was I built schedules that were more realistic, because a lot you kind of have to learn individually when you work with somebody how they predict how long their part of the process is going to take.
mhm,
Some people will go, well, I don't work on weekends, I don't work nights, I work my 8 hours and that's it, and it takes me usually about 12 hours to do a page, so it'll take me this many weeks to do this book, right? And then
mhm,
you're like, and then usually they go, and life intervenes, one day a week. So really I only work 4 days, even though it feels like five. And they'll build in, and when you're working with somebody like that, then when they give you a date, you're pretty secure in putting that date down as when that thing's going to be done. Most people don't estimate that way because
Mm,
most people feel a pressure, whether it's there or real or not, that they should get things done as fast as possible. You're not going to want to hear it takes me 2 months to do this.
mhm,
So then they'll go, well, if I work nights and weekends and I don't sleep and I don't eat and nothing happens in my life, then I could get it done in 3 weeks. And so they
mhm.
give you 3 weeks as a deadline, but realistically, that's going to take them 6 weeks or maybe even eight
Right.
weeks. Right. And so you have to learn kind of who, how they do their mental math. And then you have to sort of budget your time accordingly. So it is a very organic, very, um, and the more you work with people, the better you get at predicting their things. So that's how you try to avoid crunches. And that was one of the things that I got really good at, partially because I worked with a lot of the same creators. If they did good work and they were able to, they communicated well, then I wanted to work with them more, even if that meant I had to make adjustments to work with
Mm,
them. So I would do my best to always sort of budget those times in. And certainly there were times when I had to crunch people. I was the bearer of that bad news, but I think more often than not, creators that I worked with had uh, an appropriate amount of time to do their parts of it. But that is strangely not something that I have seen taught in like editorial training, which
mhm.
seems like a really good idea to teach that.
It
but
is. It
but
is.
I don't
Now,
see it taught.
I want to actually talk about the dilemma that you raised in the beginning, where which what does it make sense for a comic book creator to do? And this goes for colorists, but I guess it applies to anyone in the production cycle. Is it better throughout your career to kind of absorb the crunches and the change deadlines so that people who are hiring see you as an efficient member of the team? Or is it better to kind of push back on crunches and deadlines so that the quality of your work is always at a certain level and you are, there you're also avoiding burnout to have a longer career? Is it better as a general rule, knowing every situation is different, to kind of just eat the crunch or push back on the crunch?
Yeah, I mean, it is situational for sure. One of the things that I recommend is, if you're a color artist and you know other color artists that you are friends with, which happens because there are, professional color artists like Facebook groups and discords and stuff where they all kind of hang out and chat amongst themselves. It's one of the places where I talk with color artists. Um, or those are some of the places I talk with. So what I would recommend to somebody that is kind of faced with this is that maybe they could do something where it depends on how candid they want to be with the editor, but they might be like, one person doing this in the time isn't going to work. So you might be able to subcontract with somebody that that you can work
Mm-hmm.
with really well to like match styles, so that there are two people working on it and which pages are yours, they know which pages are theirs, and you guys can share to make sure that everything's consistent between them so that you're
Mm-hmm.
not putting that burden on the editor.
Mm-hmm.
You can either talk to the editor about that and say, look, this is really too much for me to do well in that time. I'd like to bring on so and so,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which potentially is really good for that person because they're getting introduced to a new editor or what have you. But so can you find a way to do what they ask in the time that they're asking, but also maintain the quality, even if that means bringing on? Because for me as an editor, if somebody says I can't do this to the best of my ability in that time, but I can solve the problem that causes you by
Right.
bringing so and so in, then I know I'm dealing with somebody that's upfront with me, that's honest, and that's and that has a realistic view of their work and cares about the quality of their work. That to me as an editor would be a good sign. I can't say that every editor would see it that way, but I think most would. So that's one potential thing that you can
Mm-hmm.
do. Um, there was one case, and this is literally in my entire career, I did this one time where I just told the color artist, I don't care who all you bring in to do this, but I have to have 22 pages done tonight. And when I come in the morning, they have to be here and they have to be in color.
Mm-hmm.
And And I said, but I don't have to credit you. Like we can come up with an Alan Smithy sort of sort of a
Mhm.
credit, so that knowing it wasn't going to be their best work, they don't get dinged for like, oh, I can't believe this comic was by this colorist. This is terrible. I don't want to hire them again. Like we didn't
Mhm.
want that to happen. This color artist was doing me a huge favor by getting it done, and they did. Actually, the pages looked better than I expected. They actually look pretty good. And I don't know if that color artist did bring in other people or how they got it done, but they got it done overnight, and then they got a credit that was not their usual name. I literally have only done that one time.
Okay.
Uh,
Now, the only thing I will say about that particular solution is that it pays to actually have a decent understanding of your contract as a freelance artist with a publisher when it comes to subcontracting, because you may or may not have the option to subcontract
yeah,
without the client's approval if it's in the contract. If it's not in the contract and you can't find it, of course, if you're crunched for time and you don't have a lot of extra time, the last thing you probably want to do is go sifting around your contract to see whether or not you could subcontract. But you don't want to necessarily create a new problem by trying to
yeah,
solve an
and
old
I
problem.
yeah, and I will say that in that case that I would just described, I knew that that creator did have a clause in his contract where they could use subcontractors. I was
There
aware
you
of
go.
that in that
There
case.
you go.
So,
There
but
you
I was wondering if you were going to bring that up, and I'm glad you did
go.
because
Of
it's
course,
important.
that's why people keep me around to talk about all of the unfortunate things that are in the contract that they may or may not have read to actually keep them from doing their job. Um, so with that, we're gonna actually talk about what's coming up in Comics Connection in the next couple of weeks. So tonight, no, tomorrow, Andy, I know you have your creative Q&A session. That's going to be at 8 o'clock on Wednesday for Comic Connection members. Um, and in that, what do you guys usually talk about when you have those open question and answer sessions?
We often wind up talking about um, crowdfunding comes up a lot,
Hmm.
as I think it does in a lot of creative circles. But we usually wind up talking about some sort of craft, like somebody's got a project, and then what I'll do is they may ask something specific to their project, and then I'll address the specific question, but I'll try and draw sort of a broader
Hmm.
topic out of it that we can discuss. And then it really is just kind of, are you hitting any kind of roadblocks, or you got something coming up and you want to prepare for it? Or, every once in a while I get a question about like, how do you schedule something like we were talking about today?
Hmm.
Or, how do we get questions about page rates a lot, and those are very
Hmm.
difficult to navigate because there just aren't standards the way there are for other industries. So, we talk about those sorts of things a lot, but we definitely talk about writing. We talk about story and art a lot. I think that's usually what it is, but it is an open Q&A. So I show up and look, if nobody has a question, I come with a topic I can always fall back on,
Hmm.
just so that people aren't wasting time there, or I'm not wasting time there. But usually we fill the time with questions from the group.
Yep. Yep. And we're going to have a business related Q&A next Wednesday. I believe that's May the 7th or 8th. I don't know. And that Q&A is also um very much led by the members who log into the Zoom. We talk about everything from marketing to distribution to legal issues to hiring people to all sorts of things. Everything that is related to the business of comics will use gets touched on a lot in those Q and A's. And Andy, we have another course starting next week.
Just the intro to comic book coloring course is starting next week.
Okay, and all of the links to the signing up for the course and for joining Comics Connection and getting a free month to actually check out what it is that we are doing will all be in the show notes. So that's going to wrap it up for us here. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and have fun with your comments.